Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and after marching to the sea and capturing Atlanta, Sherman would turn his attention to the Carolinas. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel, purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop, or join the Patreon page. Every little bit helps. Thank you. While in Savannah, Sherman paid a visit to the home of a Confederate officer. His wife and his children were the only ones there, but the woman's father was a Union officer. Sherman came into the house, and the little girls became scared after hearing all the stories of the mean old Sherman tearing through Georgia. After only a few minutes, he had the little ones on his knee and playing with them, joking about being old Sherman. One of them was named Juliet, the future founder of the Girl Scouts of America. While the citizens of Savannah and all of Georgia cowered in fear of Sherman, the North praised his amazing accomplishments. The London Times wrote, "Since the great Duke of Marlborough turned his back upon the Dutch and plunged hurriedly into Germany to fight the famous Battle of Blenheim, military history has recorded no stronger marvel than this mysterious expedition of General Sherman's rout against an unknown, undiscovered enemy." Sherman would write to Grant, "I don't like to boast, but I believe this army has a confidence in itself that makes it almost invincible." When Sherman got to Savannah, newspapers and mail came in, and Sherman found out that his newest child, Charlie, had died in South Bend, Indiana on December 4th. He took the news of losing a child he hadn't got the opportunity to see very hard. Again, a great success was a companion to a great tragedy. On his march to the sea, the army acquired a roaming pack of escaped slaves, freeing themselves from slavery. Sherman was polite to the ex-slaves who wanted to see him because he knew their information was far better than any gotten from Southern whites, but he was still aggravated at them for following the army. It caused added headaches to an already difficult task. On one occasion, troops under Jefferson C. Davis had a large band of black fugitives following behind, all with Confederate cavalry close at hand. When Davis's troops crossed Ebenezer Creek, they pulled up the pontoons, leaving the fugitives on the other side. Afraid they would be killed by the Confederate horsemen, many plunged into the water, and many of them drowned. Sherman stood by his subordinates' actions, believing that the military's success was the priority. Plus, he had told African Americans along the way not to follow the army. Most didn't listen. The Union Army symbolized freedom to them, and they went where it went. Many in the Lincoln administration admonished Sherman for the way he generally treated African Americans, knowing his pro-slavery stance. However, Sherman's mindset towards slavery and African Americans had changed somewhat from the beginning of the war. He agreed they needed to be freed, but he absolutely didn't believe they should be given the same rights as whites. Sherman's beliefs and actions concerned the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, so much so that he visited Savannah in January 1865 to meet with the local African American population. He convened with 20 of them, mostly ministers, and asked them questions, attempting to find out what the next step was for the newly freed African Americans. When Stanton asked them about Sherman, he asked Sherman to leave the room first. Sherman did as he was asked, but didn't understand why his judgment was questioned. The freedmen responded to the question about Sherman with, "We have confidence in General Sherman, and think what concerns us could not be in better hands." Sherman and Stanton discussed in length the next step, and together they helped form Special Field Orders No. 15. This order set aside the abandoned sea islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia for settlement of former slaves. Whites, except for official personnel, were prohibited from going there as well. Although Sherman helped create the order, after he gave it to a subordinate to implement, he made no effort to see that it was implemented. Sherman was eager to get out of Savannah. On February 1st, the march for the bulk of the army began. It was a miserable struggle attempting to cross the watery landscape in the winter. One of Sherman's biographers described the scene. The mud was everywhere, sucking down marching soldiers, artillery caissons, wagons, horses, and mules. The only way to cross some of the swollen streams was to build bridges across them, wading waist deep in the cold water to do so. The only way to move through the water-soaked land approaches was to corduroy them, hard, dirty work that sapped the strength of animals and men. Trees had to be cut down, trimmed of limbs, dragged through muck to the roadway, and laid down one next to another. Sometimes the mud was so watery the logs sank. Other times the lumber would float to the surface. All too often, several layers of logs were required to conquer the ooze, and even then they would shift and slip, creating traps for wagons and men. Sherman endured the hardships with his men. He talked with them as though they were all good friends, because they were. These men were his family, his army family. When his horse would slip and slide down a muddy roadside, a soldier would yell out, "Don't ride too fast, General." Sherman would chuckle and keep riding. If the people in Georgia thought Sherman was hard on them, that was nothing like what Sherman and his army would do to South Carolina. When they entered the state, Sherman told Slocum, "Don't forget that when you have crossed the Savannah River, you will be in South Carolina. You need not be so careful there about private property as we have been. The more of it you destroy, the better it will be. The people of South Carolina should be made to feel the war, for they brought it on, and are responsible more than anybody else for our presence here. Now is the time to punish them." Joseph E. Johnston, Sherman's nemesis in the Carolinas, remarked after the war that, "Your foragers were the most efficient cavalry ever known. They covered your flanks so completely that I never could penetrate through them far enough to feel your column. And the fact that they could be sent so far from the eyes of the commanding officers and return regularly at night is proof of the high state of discipline of your army." Sherman's first major target was Columbia, South Carolina. His army feinted towards Charleston and Augusta. When Confederate forces rushed to defend those areas, he struck Columbia. Cutting off Charleston from the rest of the state, that city fell in mid-February. When Sherman and his troops entered Columbia, they found a pillaged city, partly destroyed by Confederate soldiers before leaving it. The railroad depot and large storage buildings had been burned by the retreating foe. Many of the black and white residents brought liquor to the soldiers as a thank you and hopefully to stop any destruction to the city. Some half-drunk soldiers formed up to salute Sherman as he rode by. When he did so, one soldier in a dressing gown stepped forward, lifted his hat, and said, "I have the honor, General, to present you and the freedom of city." Sherman smiled, raised his hat, and then kept riding. When Sherman dismounted, the black inhabitants cheered, and one lady grabbed his hand, saying her prayers had been answered. When he came to the mayor of the city, a bunch of ragged Union soldiers who had been prisoners of war came up to him, informing him that his capture of the city resulted in their release. One of them, S.H.M. Byers, handed him a piece of paper with a poem on it. It was called Sherman's March to the Sea, or Sherman Will March to the Sea, and it was set to music and became a popular song. The two men would stay friends for the rest of their lives. After greeting people of the city, Sherman made his way to his new headquarters and took a nap. He awoke to lights flashing through the window. Before the Confederates left the city, they had piled cotton bales into the streets and set them on fire. Sherman ordered his men to put them out, but high winds had rekindled the flames, and now the city was engulfed. Sherman ordered his men to put out the fires. Many of them used the opportunity to further pillage the households. Although Sherman insisted, even after the war, that the fire came from the high winds reigniting the bales, it appears that some of the soldiers, drunk, also set the fires, making matters even worse. Sherman destroyed foundries and arsenals before leaving Columbia and headed toward North Carolina. Sherman captured Fayetteville, North Carolina on March 11th. His men treated North Carolinians more kindly than South Carolina, but they still caused a panic. They found that the resin in the tall pine trees caught fire easily and worked its way up the trees. Union soldiers found it caused great amounts of chaos and panic to set those trees on fire to make it appear multiple homes were burning behind the army. At Fayetteville, he again regained contact with the outside world and informed Grant and the Secretary of War about his progress. His men now needed new uniforms and shoes. The hard marching and campaigning had turned the clothing into rags and left the shoes in tatters. Once equipped, he would whip Johnston, commanding the forces in the Carolinas, and then join Grant against Lee.